Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. In May 1945, as the war was ending in Europe, General Moorehead's Australian Corps launched Operation Oboe in Borneo. A controversial and complicated campaign. It was the subject of my guest's latest book. Links in the description below, as always. Michael Veitch is a best-selling author and Australian legend. He's here now to talk about Borneo. Good evening where you are, morning where I am. How are you today?
Good morning / evening, Paul. Lovely to talk to you again. Thanks so much for having me on.
So we were just talking there, but Borneo, 1945, with what we were covering on World War II TV earlier this year, there is a bit of a sense of kind of war fatigue. The outcome is decided, if not yet concluded. And so you get a lot of operations happening that historians say years later in a very learned way, well, did we really need to do that? We could have perhaps done this. Whereas you've written about things earlier in the war where there's absolutely no argument. Certain places have to be defended. They have to be fought for. Earlier with the island hopping campaign, you've got to get those air bases closer to Japan to bring the end. But 1945, a lot of that stuff really isn't quite as relevant. So when you began tackling Borneo as a concept, how did you approach it?
Well, that's the best summation of the campaign that you've just given, Paul. I mean, I couldn't have done it better myself. And the way I tackled it was exactly that, because even at the time, Operation Oboe, this three-part amphibious invasion of the Japanese-occupied island of Borneo, was considered in so many circles, even before it happened, as completely and utterly unnecessary. And yet, it was the biggest and remains still the biggest amphibious operation, one of the biggest military operations undertaken by the Australian military forces ever. And the reason it's kind of obscure now, even is because it was obscure then. As you said, it was at the absolute tail end, arse end of the war. Everyone all over the world was exhausted emotionally. They didn't really care about the war anymore. They knew it was coming to an end. Everybody's thoughts were to the post-war period and what that would involve. People coming home, people who were left grieving, loved ones who are not coming home. What's life going to be looked up? The Cold War had started. So everybody had basically moved on. But Australia was left as virtually the last Allied nation fighting in the Second World War. Everybody else had packed up and gone home. And going back as to the reasons why is that in 1942, when things were desperate and the pitifully neglected Australian forces, which were suddenly under threat directly from Imperial Japan, were faced with what people believed was going to be an invasion of the Australian mainland. That was never actually on the cards, but nobody knew that then. So Douglas MacArthur arrived from his escape from the Philippines, Dugout Doug, whatever you want to call him, good and bad. And there's a lot on both sides of this camp. I know people that have been chucked off American chat groups for daring to criticize the great.
We're mostly in the negative.
The great American Caesar.
We're mostly in the negative camp here, so you can say what you like. Yeah.
Well, yes, I know. With a lot of Americans, you don't like him much either. But look, MacArthur was good and bad. But so. The new Prime Minister, John Curtin, who had come to power unexpectedly not long before Pearl Harbor, inherited this poison chalice of a country that he thought was about to be invaded, gave the entire kind of command of the Australian military to MacArthur, lock, stock and barrel. It was basically roll over on his back, please tickle my tummy, we'll do whatever you want. Probably an unfair criticism of the great Curtin because he's deified in many left of centre circles in this country. But it meant that MacArthur relied on Australia initially, particularly in the Great Kokoda campaign. But when America got going, he didn't really need us. And so fast forward to 1945, he didn't need us at all. And we were almost a bit of a nuisance because we were quite a strong army. But we were kind of put in and we'd earned our chops in the Middle East, and we weren't involved in continental Europe, as you know. But then we were sort of sent to kind of mop up bits of New Guinea after the Japanese hadn't departed, but they'd given up on it. They knew they couldn't win. So Australia was doing that, and about a year before, mid-1945, from about early 1944 to early 1945, the Australian Army was essentially doing nothing.
Yeah.
It's training. It had been brought back from the Middle East, the 7th and the 9th Divisions. They were essentially training in northern Queensland, in the kind of wet tropical areas of northern Queensland, with the expectation that there'd be another gig later in the war. We lobbied MacArthur and said, people like Tom Blamey said, well, we're here, and we're allies, and we're at your beck and call, but are you going to use us? And MacArthur, who was notoriously weird in so many ways, he did things like he'd often refer to himself in the third person, kind of strange way. He would get photographers. He was already like 6'3" or something. He would apparently get photographers to kneel down to take pictures of him, even out in the field, so he'd look even taller than he was. Anyway, strange things like that. He promised that the First Australian Army Corps would be part of the invasion of the Philippines, and so that's what the expectation was. In the first part of the book, I sort of discuss how that was sort of petered out, and the Australian Army was furious that they were going to be left with nothing to do, and almost as a kind of an afterthought, it was, Borneo's occupied still, go and get rid of that, because one of the reasons MacArthur decided that was because the Americans didn't really want to be seen restoring a European colony. Because in the map there that you have, Paul, 90% of that is a part of the Dutch East Indies, and that little bit at the top, in the top left-hand corner, were the three protectorates of Britain: Sarawak, North Borneo, and Brunei. I think it was all lumped. It was just all referred to as British North Borneo. So it was decided that the Australian Army would expend its forces liberating the island of Borneo in 3 stages, more or less a month apart: June, July, August 1945. And of course, August was when the war essentially ended. I mean, it ended on the 2nd of September in Tokyo Bay, but the bombs were dropped on August, the 6th or something.
Yeah.
And Australia had really, basically, it sort of landed a few weeks before. So May, June, July. Sorry, not August.
Yeah.
May, June, July. It was all codenamed Oboe. It was going to be initially 6 separate landings. 3 were scrubbed because it was realised they were ridiculous. 1 was to, sail into Java, which was the enormously strong Japanese stronghold of Java. We would have been slaughtered. Another one was to invade other parts of Borneo. The premise was to take some airstrips that the Japanese had built, or one the Dutch had built and the Japanese had it, and to take the oil facilities, which were significant. It is, I don't know, I think the oil's all gone now, but then it was a massive source of almost pure high-quality oil, and is why it was so high on the list of the Japanese to invade in 1942. But I'll pause for a bit because I'll just ramble on otherwise. So you have to just interrupt me, Paul, or I just won't.
No worries. I mean, oil and rubber as well. And I just wanted to, as you mentioned, airfields. We've done so many shows on this channel about the needs to get those air bases closer to Japan. I said so in my introduction, but
yeah,
Borneo
this is not close to Japan.
It's the opposite direction, isn't it? The progression.
It's the opposite direction. Up.
So that seems to be a bit of a red herring, Well, we need these airfields. You've got others now that are. But anyway, and you're not going to be able to fly B-29s out of Borneo. That's the main striking unit. So it is a lot of
There
this.
was so much politics involved. One of the reasons that MacArthur directed the Australians to Borneo was to keep the British out.
Yeah.
Because he did not want the British Pacific Fleet to have anything to do with the liberation of this part of Asia. MacArthur very early on decided that the defeat of Japan was going to be an all-American affair. He had no interest in any other, even his own parts, and the American Army, not the US Navy, not even the Marines. The Marines played no part in MacArthur's stepping towards Japan. Nimitz, because the Americans had this weird system where they split the Pacific in two, and one was under command of Nimitz, and the other was under command of Douglas MacArthur. And these two men did not get on, and they did not see eye to eye. So MacArthur didn't believe in this sort of island hopping. He just wanted to go straight to the jugular via the Philippines. But he wanted to get back to the Philippines because he's had this huge emotional investment in the Philippines, because that's where he'd been kicked out of. You know, back to Bataan and I shall return and all that crap. It's hard to say. Maybe he was right. I've often thought that the island hopping campaign of the United States in itself was weird. I mean, why didn't they just sort of neutralize their Air Force and Navy and let them all starve to death? If the Japanese are on these islands, they couldn't get anywhere, just leave them there. But that's not what happened, as we know.
Yeah. So you talked about, this being, I mean, there is some American support for Oboe. There's a little bit of British support on the side, but as you said, it's primarily Australian. What, the 27,000, two divisions and the corps. But when we look at the
it could not have happened without the full support of the United States Navy. Australia didn't have any ships. The ships we had were borrowed from you guys, repainted. They put a couple more boilers in, and then basically they all got lost in the Battle of the Java Sea. We lost the Perth. We'd lost the Sydney because the stupid captain in the Sydney got too close to a German merchant raider, blah, blah, got his bow blown off and sunken with all hands. Terrible story. We lost we lost so many ships unnecessarily. We had no Navy, essentially, and certainly nothing like the United States. We needed the United States Navy to transport us from the huge base at Morotai, which is just north of New Guinea, the week-long sea journey to Borneo. So we were carried by the United States. And they gave great support on ground. Unfortunately, their Air Force was gung-ho, and they started, strafing Australian soldiers on the ground. They did that several times, but that's what Americans always do.
I mean, it's also remarkable that this is happening concurrently with the second half of the Okinawa campaign. I mean, when we talk about the Allies in 1942, where they haven't got a pot to piss in, and they're struggling to get anything for any theaters, by 45, the Allies are able to mount multiple operations concurrently and still not really stretch themselves in terms of resources. Although, as you say, getting the oil from Borneo would help out in a kind of the next stage and post-war, I guess. But there's a great story there. Because MacArthur had to justify Borneo to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, and then they were very suspicious of him for very good reason. And his big thing was, I need the Australian Army as a reserve. He wanted to use Australians as a reserve in the Philippines, and Australia just said, no way, Jose. And so he said, all right, we'll go into Borneo because we really got to get the airfields, and we got to get the oil. And Washington said, you sure we need the oil? And MacArthur commissioned this, his name's in the book, I'm sorry, I don't have the book in front of me, a senior oil executive from Standard Oil, who had been brought into the army as the head of the United States sort of petroleum supply lines. And MacArthur approached him to come and do a survey of how much this would add, Borneo's oil
would add to the American pool of oil, because all American oil had to be transported by tankers. And this guy, he did the survey and said, well, you don't really need it. In fact, it would add about, maybe 2 or 3 tankers to the whole thing. We don't really. We've got enough oil now to last us well into 1946. So immediately one of the planks was taken out. The other plank was the airstrips. There was a major airstrip on the island of Tarakan, which is on the top, which is on the right-hand side at the top there. That was on the 1st of May. You can see 45. That was Oboe 1. There was this little island off the big island of Borneo itself, and there was a major airstrip on it. But the airstrip was routed anyway. It was completely waterlogged. Planes couldn't land on it. And if they did land on it, they couldn't take off again because it was so soggy. It's all tidal. Can you just go back to that previous shot there? Can you go back one? The one right there. Just see, that's what the tides were like in this part of the world. That tide, an LST, I think, landing ship tank, I think. The tide's gone out past, so it's just sitting flat-bottomed on the mud. So that's what the tides were like. So the tides came up under this airstrip that the Dutch had built. And they could hardly use it. The Japanese could hardly use it. And then to add insult to injury, the Australians bombed the crap out of it. There we are. The Tarakan airstrip. So despite being one of the objectives made, it was wrecked by the Allied bombing even before. They sent out Liberator bombers in from Darwin and Morotai to absolutely plaster it, and was one of the things that they went into fight. Apparently, when the Australian engineers finally fought their way up from the beaches to look at the airstrip to open it, they went, "Oh shit, mate, this isn't going to happen." So that meant, and this airstrip was supposed to be used as the forward base for the next stage of Oboe, which was Balikpapan. But they said, we can't use it. It's useless. We can't land anyone here. So they had to get in Mars and matting and throw that down. And even then, the water came up under the matting. So planes would land in this spewing mud and water, covered their windshield, and some of them just slid off and spun and crashed and stuff. But we should get to the serious side of this. I mean, it wasn't a farce because, and this is what I had no idea about, Paul. Australian students of military history know about Kokoda. We know about Alamein. We know about Alamein 1 and 2. I think Alamein 1, I think Tel Eliza has been one of the great untold. You probably have, my friend, spoken about it, but it's an amazing battle. And the Australians and the I think the Welsh Guards or something did something incredible work there. Anyway, blah blah blah. The Australians, the 2 big Australian divisions were brought back. And then there's all the business, Saddleberg, and we did some business over in the Solomon Islands.
Yep.
Borneo, right at the end, hardly anyone really thinks about it because it was just like a bit of a fag in, oh yeah, that's the one we did at the end. I had no idea until I started researching this book how intense the fighting was in terms of simple military blood and guts. These series of campaigns had absolutely everything. I had no idea. The Japanese, even though they knew they were utterly defeated, fought with a tenacity that beggars belief. And the Australians were thrown up against them on the ground. It was just the Australians. The Americans, apart from a couple of units that were, there's actually one incredible story where the Japanese broke out of their emplacements in the hills. They'd fortified and broke through. They just slipped past one night and caused merry mayhem in one of the American beach landing units that just supplied the alligators and the ducks. And there was this gunfight and fires and battles in the middle of the night. It's quite an incredible story. But they, on each separate each separate stage of what ended up being the 3 Oboe campaigns, Oboes 1, Oboes 2, and Oboe 6, which was, sorry, Oboe 1 was Tarakan, Oboe 6 was North Borneo, Labuan, an island called Labuan, and the last one, Oboe 2, I think, was Balikpapan. On each occasion, the Australians bombarded the shore with an absolutely extraordinarily high-powered display of firepower, bringing in everything. Cruisers, no battleships as such, but cruisers, heavy cruisers from the United States Navy, napalm. They called it gelatol back then. I don't think the word napalm hadn't been used, but this is the first instance where napalm had been used in battle. We had flame-throwing tanks. We pinched a couple of Matilda tanks, and we used them to quite good effect. They were, I'm afraid it's like most British tanks of World War II. They were slightly over-engineered, Paul, but it did its job. Everywhere the Japanese were dug in, everywhere they fought with tenacity, booby traps were everywhere. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of booby traps. They had to deal with the civilians.
Yeah.
These people who had been, and look at the bloody battle machine gun cannon holes in that shed behind them.
Mm-hmm.
This is on the poor Chinese and Javanese who'd been starved by the Japanese. The cruelty of the Japanese, not just towards the Australians that they captured, as we know, but the people of India and the people of Java and the Chinese, unnecessary and almost in the realms of sadism, you can only say, and which I don't think's ever been properly addressed, particularly by Japanese people today. I had a visit a few years ago to the Tokyo Army Museum in Tokyo, and you can go there and there's this fabulous restored Zero in the front foyer, and when you start reading some of the stuff, but anyway, let's not go there. But it was a very, very fierce series of battles that were fought across a relatively small scale, but the interior of all these islands suddenly became incredibly hilly with lots and lots of gullies. It was unbelievably humid. So, 80% humidity. I mean, if anyone's ever been to these places, and I have, it's like just having a quiet walk down to get a coffee is hard enough. If you're actually in a battle, I mean, I'm terrible. One of the saving graces was there was no malaria, or very little malaria, because some of the islands were so ridden with oil, the Japanese oil. The Japanese at a place called Seria on British North Borneo set fire to about 200 wells, and the Australians had to become firemen and put them all out again. I love that shot that I found at the AWM. I think it's a pretty good one, isn't it? It has such movement, and that's one of the wellheads, and they had to resort to being, Red Adair's fighting oil fires.
Just to interrupt you, how much influence do you think?
Please do.
The special operations had in the previous couple of years, because there's various places the Allies went to in the Pacific where there had been basically nothing except air raids, and the Marines or the Army that land on the beach are really the first boots on the ground. But Borneo had seen SAS, SBS, Z Special Forces.
Yes.
With limited success, I think it's fair to say, but they had to some extent, and Phil Craig talked about this a few weeks ago, the local population were invested to a certain degree in the outcome of the campaign. How much influence did that prior work have on the operations?
Well, I think it was quite significant. I deal with a chapter in this, and it's I called the chapter "This Tiny Army of the Brave," which is one of the quotes by Tom Harrison, who is one of the most eccentric figures from history, and ever described as only the British public school system could throw up a character like Tom Harrison. So Tom Harrison was kind of a bit of a social outcast. He came from a very good family, but the usual story: alcoholic mother, father that probably hated him, younger son kicked off to the colonies somewhere. But he loved Borneo, and he'd spent a lot of time in Borneo, and was a brilliant field naturalist and an ornithologist in the 1930s. And he came back and joined up, was in a British regiment doing not much until about 1944, when the British SOE collared him and said, look, the Australians are looking for someone to lead a special operations executive, like a SOE type operation into Borneo. And he said, I'm your man. I know every inch of it. So they flew him out here, Australia, trained him up a bit, and then dropped him in with a very, very small amount of Z Special Commandos into Borneo in the weeks and months before the first landings, usually, mainly around North Borneo, to try and rally the Dayak people. Now, Dayak's a pretty lazy kind of colonial term. There are 200 totally homogeneous tribes in Borneo. Borneo's huge. It's the size of New South Wales. It's far bigger than Britain. It's a huge place. 200 tribes. It's famous for headhunters and blowpipes, and they didn't even tell. Get this, they didn't even tell. Had no word to the native people that the special forces were on their way, and these guys were told, "Look, we're going to drop you in. You're going to jump out of a B-24. We don't really know what the reception's going to be because they don't really know you're coming. So what's either going to happen is that they'll either welcome you with open arms and join up immediately and form this army. We'll supply the guns later on. They'll simply turn you over to the Japanese, or they'll cut your head off, or both. So good luck."
Yeah.
As it happened, it was the first option, because so you had these blokes who were not actually told their destination until they had taken off from either Darwin or Morotai, and they were briefed on the plane, parachuted out, given a map, and said, "All right, there's a village there. Go and find your way there and talk to the village chief and see what he thinks about it." As it happened, sorry, that's right. But that's what they were told. They said, almost as an afterthought, they said, and tell them that we're here to kick the Japanese out for good. And by the way, you can do some more headhunting. Because headhunting had been banned from about the 1930s in British North Borneo, because the British said, it's a little bit too, goodness me, no, you can do other things, but no, please don't. So they were really sad about that. But when these guys arrived and said, and you can do more headhunting, they then found out three things. It was like, what do you think of the British? Yeah, British, all right. We don't mind the British. What do you think of the Australians? We really like the Australians. They're a bit more rugged. They're kind of like us. What do you think of the Dutch? Yeah, we hate the Dutch. And what do you think of the Japanese? And I've described in the book the only emotion every Dayak tribe described about the Japanese was a dark and murderous loathing. The Japanese had, as everywhere they occupied, screwed it up. The Japanese Empire could have been far more successful, but they were so stupid that they didn't even know how to get the native people on side, and they alienated them almost immediately, and then started killing them essentially. So they were so ready to start killing Japanese that they didn't even have to try. When the words went out through the rivers and the valleys of Borneo, thousands of these guys turned up saying, "I'm your man." And these people were brilliant fighters, naturally disciplined. They flew a few sergeants in. After an hour, they could drill perfectly, standing to attention. And they were natural soldiers. They used blowpipes, which were incredibly effective. They're like something out of Star Wars or something. Blowpipe. They're more out of Game of Thrones, because they found this sap that just kills you, and you go, and unlike a rifle shot, it doesn't give away the shooter, and if you miss, you just do it again.
And I'm glad you talked about
very
that,
successful.
because some of the books written just after the war, during the war, as you said earlier, they were a little bit, the language used to describe the indigenous peoples is not language we'd use. They kind of respect their bravery, but there's definitely kind of a patronizing attitude and tone about, yes, well, the locals were jolly good fellows and they help, so I'm glad we're in an era where we're giving them a bit of identity. So we had a question from Matthew over in Australia about the, no, sorry, not that one.
Matthew.
About POW camp liberation, because when we go back to the reasons behind the invasion, the airstrip may a bit dodgy. But there were people who were freed by these, weren't there? Who had been prisoners for some time.
Not well. Okay, what people know Borneo for is the utter horrific catastrophe of Sandakan and the Sandakan death marches that actually were winding up before Oboe got away. This was more earlier in 1945. It was these, as far as Oboe was concerned, Oboe's been very much overshadowed by the horror of the Sandakan Death March, in which thousands of Australian and British and American PWs were murdered. They were marched to death. So it was not known by the general soldier the extent of Japanese POW camps, what their intentions were. Very poor reconnaissance during the years had been conducted on where people were, where all these poor bastards that had been captured in Singapore from the 8th Division, etc., where they were being starved to death. They knew about the Burma Road, but not much. There were plans to go and find out that there was some code given to the operation that was going to be flying in, liberating the camps. But then they said, well, how do we do this? It was just impossible. And so they basically, from what little reading I've done, and Matthew, is this my publisher, Matthew Kelly from Hachette? I wonder if it's another Matthew.
I don't think so. I think it's another one, but maybe.
Okay. Really needs a whole video of its own. I couldn't agree more, Matthew. It's an incredible story. It doesn't really play a part in Oboe. And when the blokes came back, they often didn't know about Sandakan until long after the war. That was kept a bit of a secret. It was like the bombing of Darwin. It was kept a bit of a secret. But one of the reasons that Oboe's been overshadowed and why the veterans themselves kept quiet, because they almost felt ashamed, because it's like, oh, well, we only lost 600 or so people, which is a lot. Put 600 young Australians into a hall and it looks like a lot. It looks like a lot of bloody people. So I know it's not on the big scale. I know, and many more thousand, but many more casualties, by the way. So yeah, that kind of petered out. I'm glad you put the picture of Diver up here, because
we'll do a couple of the stories of the the legendary Aussie soldiers that fought there, but to wind things up. And Diver Derek,
I think it's funny. Often military heroes are like that, sort of so contrary to type. You think that they're kind of big macho men. Who was, my blanked on his name, the fellow who won the VC at Milne Bay. I'll have to Google it. There was in Vine 42 with incredible heroics. He was a hairdresser in Adelaide. He had a family of hairdressers. He used to do ladies, rinse and curls and dyes, and that was his job before the war. Diver Derek was a fruit picker. Tom, they call him Diver because he dived off a pier and did something once. No, he didn't dive for a living or anything. He was a fruit picker, and he sort of was a bit itinerant, and he married just before the war and had a lovely wife who he wrote to. He wrote poetry. He collected butterflies. He was kind of like a gentle, softly spoken man. He was in the Middle East, and he would have to be. I love the stories of Diver when he had to basically sack one of his subordinates, a corporal who just wasn't leading a section properly, and he traumatized for days. Had to get advice. What do I do? Well, mate, you've just got to sack him. He's not doing his job. This is a war. People get killed, and so he was incredibly considerate to his men. He was famous for brilliant Cockney rhyming slang. He'd won the Victoria Cross at a place called Shaggy Ridge, which was on, which was a bizarre battle. That's nuts. It was along literally this ridge so high in the New Guinea highlands that they said you can see the whole of New Guinea from this. Well, you couldn't. Well, you could because it was always fogged in.
Yeah.
And often the battle was like across a ridge that was 2 people wide, could fit along it, and it was firing and everything. But Derek won the VC there. He had a premonition that going off to Borneo was going to be his last. He wasn't coming back from it. On one of the last days, last days of an engagement on one of the ridges, I can't remember what ridge it was now, but it was a night engagement. The Japanese attacked at night time, and they often had hardly any weapons, and they would often attack with spears and swords, had a lot of hand grenades, but Japanese hand grenades were pretty crappy. They often didn't go off, and they didn't have much punch to them, but they would give it their best. And they pushed forward to one of these ridges, and Derek was with he'd been promoted to a junior officer at this stage, and he did something incredibly stupid. He just made one mistake. And he didn't have to. There was a burst of machine gun fire near the airstrip. I think this was on Tarakan, and they didn't know. He tried to see where the Japanese machine gun fire was coming from, and he stood up. He got up out of his foxhole and stood up in the dark and thought he was safe. And then there was another burst, and it went right through him. And that was it. He took about a day to die, and then went, because he was a legend in the Australian Army, not just in the 9th Division. He was a legend all through the Australian Army. And when the news got around that he had died about 24 hours later, it was a wail of mourning. It was really like it was like the death of Achilles. It really was.
Yeah.
It was the how can someone like this go on such a pissy little fag end campaign like this that's just as bloody rugged as the rest of them. But
somehow
it
seems better if you die in a noble event that absolutely saves the lives of thousands, or it's a critical turning point of the war. But as you said, this all seems a little bit, unnecessary and a bit pointless and a bit, and so when someone dies like that, it's somehow even worse. I mean, the dying is the same, but the way the public and the fellows react to it is different.
His death did not save a single life. He just made a foolish error in the middle of the night. Something that we do every day, but in his case,
you saw that a lot in our shows earlier this year about the kind of the last campaigns in Europe in 45. You do see soldiers just making mistakes. They're knackered, they're exhausted, they're not processing the events in quite the same efficiency they were when they started. But we've got another absolute legend, the Victoria Cross, the final Victoria Cross of the war here. So another great story. Oh, I can't hear you. See, you've dropped your voice. I can't hear you for some reason. Don't know what's gone wrong. Nope, still can't hear you. That's weird. Okay, no worries. Yeah, so folks, we've got another show later on today. Chadburn is coming in to talk about. Rob Forbes is coming on to talk about Chadburn, an incredible Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who was above the beaches of Dieppe in 1942, which was the anniversary of that was yesterday. He was also a nominee. Rob has got a new book about him. That's later on in whatever it is, 8 hours time or something. As always, while we're waiting for Mike to come back in, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books. Michael Veitch's book is listed in the description below. Hopefully he'll join us again. Can you? Hello again? No. We've not got you for some reason. I don't know what's going on there. In Gremlins. Well, we'll see what's going on. No worries. If not, we can come back. But yeah, it is Starcevic, if you are asking about there in the sidebar, but we'll see. No, definitely lost Michael. We'll carry on. We'll give it a couple of minutes. I love it when these things happen. Internet gremlins. I had a question about Australians enlistment, or was there conscription? I believe there was conscription, but the first forces were all volunteers, and you have the territorials, or the chocos as they called them. Hopefully we can get Michael back, but maybe not. Papua New Guinea was a territory of Australia, so you'll see conscripts there, but not in Borneo, Matthew is saying. No, I think we have lost Michael. I'll put my glass on so I can see. That's annoying. No. Michael is talking to us live from his club in Melbourne. Well, they say talking to us. He's waving at us at the moment. Yeah, we haven't lost him. Just his voice, Scott. Exactly. Yeah. We'll see. I think. Give me a thumbs up if you think you better come back in, or thumbs down if he is going to come back in. There we are. No. Well. Put my glasses on so I can see. No, still not got you. These are fun, these episodes. No. World War II via the medium of sign language and dance. I think Michael probably could dance. Yeah, that'd be good. A good first for World War II TV. Well, Michael will tell the VC story through the medium of interpretive dance. I think we have lost Michael. What we'll do is we'll schedule a part 2 of this some point, and we'll bring Michael back in, and we'll carry on this story because don't worry, Mike. We'll bring you back in at another point. I'll let you go back to your club. We'll end this one now. You want me to give you one more try? Yes. Still not got you. No worries. We'll bring you back another time, Michael. You enjoy the rest of your evening there. And we'll bring you back another time. So, folks, I'm back in a few hours' time. We will pick this up with a part 2 at some point. I don't know when it will be, but in the meantime, thank you, Michael, for leaving us on a cliffhanger there. We'll do the story when we come back. But, folks, it's been fantastic listening to Michael. The link to his book is in the description below, but we'll bring him back at some point to continue this on. So, folks, I'll see you all again later on. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers. Bye.